or the example of the Prophet, which he would do in addition to his obligation, and what we are doing on our own initiative. It's very important in the teachings of the Imams not to ever let those lines be blurred. And the example here we have is from wudu, but there are many other examples that we can think of in different areas of our practice. The Sharia should be maintained in its originality and in its pristine form as taught by the Prophet and by the Imams, and not changed in any way. Please recite salawat. One other hadith that also illustrates the connection between the cleanliness, the purity, and the spiritual benefit of wudu is a hadith which is narrated from the Prophet, in which he says, لَيُبَالِغْ أَحَدُكُمْ فِي الْمَضْمَضَةِ وَالْإِسْتِنْشَاقِ فَإِنَّهُ غُفْرَانٌ لَكُمْ وَمَفَرَّةٌ لِلشَّيْطَانِ. The Prophet said, this is part of what he had legislated or he had made his sunnah, that be careful and be thorough when you rinse your mouth and when you rinse your nose before the wudu. Because فَإِنَّهُ غُفْرَانٌ لَكُمْ, because it is a source of forgiveness for you, وَمَنْفَرَةٌ لِلشَّيْطَانِ, and it causes shaitan to flee. Now, what is the message that we are getting from this hadith? The Prophet could have simply said that it is a source of good hygiene. It is a source of good health. It will prevent sickness, it will prevent disease. And it is not as if the Prophet and the Imams did not give that physical or medical or hygienic advice to their companions and to their followers. We have many ahadith where the Prophet and the Imams, they would give that kind of instruction to their followers. But here the Prophet did not say rinse your mouth or rinse your nose or keep this hygiene for the sake of good health. The Prophet said that it is a source of forgiveness and it causes shaitan to flee. This physical good health, you might be able to do your own research or your own observation and figure out that it keeps you healthy, that it prevents you from getting sick. But what message we need to get from the Prophet, and the message that he gave us, is that in addition to that, good hygiene is good for your spiritual health. If you are healthy, then shaitan will stay away from you. If you are healthy, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive you. Some people have said that shaitan in these ahadith is actually a figurative and an indirect way that the Prophet would use or the Imams would use to refer to germs. Because people did not know what germs were, so the Prophet would figuratively say shaitan stays away in order to tell people that harm, that sickness will stay away. Because the Prophet could not actually speak to them directly, they wouldn't have understood what he was referring to. They could not see those germs and they wouldn't be able to appreciate what bacteria or viruses were. But there's no reason for us to say the Prophet was referring physically to only those physical types of sickness or harm. This hadith, as it was understood by the people at that time, and in its general sense, it simply says that any time a person maintains their physical hygiene, their physical well-being, that also has an effect on their soul and on their spiritual health. We shouldn't think of them as two distinguished things. A better believer is a believer who is clean, a person who takes care of their appearance, a person who takes care of their environment and their surroundings. That is a part of Iman and it is a part of faith. And this message is something which Islam emphasized so much because so many religions and so many philosophies give the exact opposite message. That a person is more spiritual if they are less careful about their hygiene or their physical appearance or their health or their well-being. If they are not concerned about it, if they don't take care of their surroundings and their environment, then their mind and their thought is always on the hereafter and they're not distracted by this world, so they must be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Islam, it has the exact opposite message. That it is a person who is in the best health, who is also in a position to be in the best spiritual health. So these are a few of the ahadith that we had about wudu. There is one final issue that I would like to look at today, and this is another area which was a matter of dispute between the different schools of thought within Islam. As we know, wudu consists of two parts of the body that are to be washed and two parts of the body that are to be wiped. The two washings are the face and the forearms. And the two parts of the body that are to be wiped are the head and the feet. So these are the areas of the body that we are ordered to wash before every prayer. Some Muslims, they changed that method and they began wiping, instead of on the head itself, on a turban or a scarf that a person might have on their head. And much more commonly and much more frequently, instead of wiping on their feet, they would wipe on what is known as khuffayn, or on their shoes or socks, especially leather socks. And they won't take them off and wipe on their feet themselves. So the Imams, they had many ahadith in which they emphasized that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verse of wudu in the Quran, He mentioned وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ, that wipe your heads and your feet. And that verse of the Quran, it cannot be misconstrued. Allah said wipe the head and the feet, so if you wipe something else, then that is not proper. It is a misapplication of that Quranic command and the teachings of the Prophet. One of the things that the Imams mentioned is that when a person wipes on their khuffayn, those leather stockings or those leather socks, then the wisdom behind wudu, which was to have the water make contact with a person's own body, and the effect that it has on a person physically and spiritually, that will not be there anymore. And there is a very interesting way in which the Imam mentions how this is the case. Our sixth Imam, he was asked, Salawat, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali. Our sixth Imam was asked, Ma taqulu fil masah ala al-khuffayn? What do you say about wiping on these leather socks? Now, at that time, it had become the common ruling of perhaps a majority of the Muslims or a great deal of the Muslim world, and it was not always easy for the Imam to very directly say that that is not proper. People would say, well, what about these companions or what about these scholars who actually practice in that way? So the Imam, it is said that فَتَبَسَّمْ, he smiled. ثُمَّ قَالْ إِذَا كَانَ يَوْمُ الْقِيَامَةِ, if the day of judgment were to come, وَرَدَّ اللَّهُ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ إِلَى شَيْئِهِ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were to return everything to its origin, everything to its source. وَرَدَّ الْجِلْدِ إِلَى الْغَنَمِ, and then the leather from those leather socks, it was returned to the sheep from which it came. فَتَرَى أَصْحَابَ الْمَسْحِ أَيْنَ يَذْهَبُ وُضُوءُهُم, so those who will wipe on that leather, where will their wudu go? Now that was not necessarily a literal hadith of the Imam, even though its literal sense is true. But what the Imam is saying is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He legislated wudu, He legislated it so that the water will come into contact with our body. It will have an effect on us, it will purify us, and it will also remind us that these are now the organs by which we are going to go face to face with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the organs that will be questioned on the Day of Judgment. This very face and these very hands are going before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I am going to stand before my Creator. I am going to put my hands forward in supplication and ask Him for His blessings and His sustenance. My hands, they are going to be asked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the Day of Judgment what they did. My head will be asked about what